Okay, we're going to get started with Chapter 7, and we're going to be talking in this chapter about selection decisions and personnel law. So let's start with the selection decisions component of it, and I'm going to give you just a brief overview of what we're going to be covering in this portion. So we've talked before about tools that we can use to select employees, and at the end of that lecture I talked about how much more information we get if we do a group of selection tests all together. We call that group a battery, right? So we give you multiple predictors, and then we're going to use those to make hiring decisions. We're going to use those for making promotion decisions and for layoff decisions. So as always, the first step is going to be job analysis. So we have to figure out what the job description and specifications are so that we can develop a good, accurate set of predictors to compose our selection battery. The more tests we use, the greater the proportion of the variance will be accounted for. So now I'm hesitating because I said the more tests, but of course the more related tests, ones that have something to do with the job specifications and the job description. More is not just necessarily better. It has to be related to what you're actually, whatever the criterion is going to be. So generally we're going to be looking at, some set of multiple measures. So this is our brief review. Hopefully that all sounds familiar to you from our earlier chapter. Now, the benefits of using a selection battery rather than just an individual test is, okay, so let's say that we have some kind of criterion that we want to assess. I don't know who we're hiring today. Let's say we're hiring a person to run the cash register at the local hardware store. Okay, so in that job, there are some skills, there are some, case hours, knowledge that we want, some abilities. So that would all together come together and produce criterion performance called being successful as a cashier. Let's say that in our selection battery, we decided to include a work sample. That's going to account for, if you recall from our earlier chapter, about 0.36 of the variance between employees on the criterion. So a work sample will help us to make a pretty good prediction. Let's say that we decided to hold an assessment center. Maybe our local hardware store is a branch of a larger company, and so they have resources available to them that would allow them to hold an assessment center. That's going to account for a reasonable amount of the variance between people. And then of course we're going to have an interview, because as we discussed before, you can't get away with an interview, right? And especially if we do a structured interview, well, that's going to do a pretty good job. At the minimum, if you just sort of interview the person to see if you like them or not, it's going to account for maybe 0.10. So none of these is particularly good by itself, but if we sort of pool them together and use them as sort of as if it was a single tool, we could say that the multiple correlation is going to be about 0.74. A multiple correlation, a multiple regression is where you have more than just two variables that you're correlating together. Those of you who have had statistics are very familiar with correlations where you can put two variables in at a time. Here we're talking about being able to put more than two variables in and see how they all interact with each other, how well those additional factors predict criterion performance. And we have, let's say, a 0.74 given the three components of our selection battery. Now if you square that multiple R, you will get the coefficient of determination, and it comes out to 0.55 in this case. So what that means is that if we were to run this battery, we could have about 55% of the variability between individuals being accounted for by this battery of tests. So by themselves, none of them are that good. You'll notice all of these are R squares that I reported. So none of them are individually that great, but if you put them together, you can really boost the predictability. So hopefully that helps to really underscore why well-chosen well-administered components of a selection battery can work together to provide really good predictive, this coefficient of determination can really go up. Okay, something that we have to really consider when we're talking about selection is recruitment. We really want to encourage potentially qualified applicants to seek employment with our organization, whoever we're wanting to select for. You want to have a good pool of candidates, right? We don't want to have 2 people show up, and then what's the point of even doing this really elaborate battery if we don't have very many people to choose among? So the quality or the efficiency of the selection system is going to be limited by the applicant quantity and quality, right? If we don't have very good candidates, our selection battery is going to be sort of wasted. Some of the traditional methods of recruitment would be college placement offices. Those of you who are looking to graduate soon and are looking for jobs, our career services is awesome and does a really good job of putting community businesses and even businesses throughout the state. We have really good connections, even though we're here in Cheney. We have really good connections with the west side of the state and stuff. So it's really, a lot of recruiters look to universities and colleges as the, feeder for their place of employment. In the olden days, they would place newspaper ads. Probably don't do that too much anymore. I don't know. There are if you pick up the local newspaper, you might find certain ads that I'm always a little skeptical about whether those are real jobs or not. Probably really one of the best ways to find a job that might be a good match for you is knowing somebody who already works there and they tell you what the job is like and things like that, so that you really are targeting your job search. And as an employer, asking your good employees, presumably they work here and you like them, and so you would like more people like them. Well, their friends and family might be a good target for that. Some organizations have an absolute no way on family members. So they may tell you, yeah, you may have the greatest cousin in the world, but we're not even going to interview them because that's nepotism. We're not doing it. Plus, you guys might get into a fight at work and all sorts of other things. So employee referrals can be a really good source of leads for an organization. And then holding job fairs. A lot of times there are giant job fairs at like convention centers and things like that. And all different kinds of organizations will set up their booth and try and find eager candidates who would be good matches for them. And then probably the most popular these days is internet ads running from, Craigslist all the way to like Indeed. There's all sorts of places where employers can put up their feelers trying to find people. LinkedIn is a good place. Trying to find the people that would be good matches for them. And so they try and put their name out and the fact that they're hiring out in places where people will find people who they think would be good candidates would find that information. Some recent trends in recruitment. Recruits are oftentimes really considering the organization's reputation and values. It used to be the case that, the job was the job and you worked there and it wasn't necessarily a reflection of your identity or something like that. It was just sort of, everybody knew it was just what you did for a living. More recently, candidates have been really concerned about how other people feel about the place where they're going to be working, whether the place that they're going to be working really represents their personal values. They've been looking for a good person-environment fit. I found a nice word cloud that illustrates the person-environment fit because it's a lot of things. And it's one of these concepts that's hard to define. But what people are looking for is a match between their own knowledge, skills, abilities, and other things, their values, right? And then the job's demands and the organization's characteristics. So this is kind of a reflection of the idea that people are being a little bit, they're able to hold back a little bit as far as just finding a job and maybe can look for one that's a really good match for them, a really good fit for them. Community diversity and individual differences within the organization are really important factors for racially diverse applicants. Also for applicants who have disabilities and things like that, oftentimes they're looking for organizations where they wouldn't be the only person who represents their group, whether it's race or ethnicity or disability or sex. A lot of times people don't want to be the one person there, and so they'll look for organizations that are diverse. Now, some recent trends with regard to what employers are looking on at, what they're relying on is a lot more emphasis on the internet, right? There are a lot of job boards that they can put their advertisement on. A lot of them rely on their own website. One of the things that employers think is if you're interested in working there, you should know about them. And so some employers only advertise on their own website. And, if you're interested in working at that company, you need to be checking their website to see if they have any jobs available. Now, the organizations that have that luxury are organizations where a lot of people want to work. If you're a smaller employer or something like that, you're probably going to want to take advantage of job boards. A lot of employers are taking advantage of cyber vetting these days, and it's really good for all of us to remember that, the things we put out on the internet may have an impact on an employer's judgment of our suitability for fitting into their company or for that particular position. They'll look at your Facebook page or whatever is the current thing at the time. I don't even know if Instagram is currently the Snapchat. A lot of times people think, oh, it disappears. But of course, people can screenshot your Snapchats and post them other places. If you hold a personal blog, a lot of people like to share their own opinion. Sometimes people will put on their personal blogs things that they think are completely fine, and they think it's like it's an advantage that they're putting these things on their blogs. And then the organization is like, this is not, you're expressing ideas that we don't want to be associated with, things like that. If you have a YouTube channel, they may look at those things. So a good company that's looking for a good candidate may search through the internet looking for your footprints there to find out what kinds of things that you stand for. I don't know how much they'll take into consideration, the fact that you were younger when this happened or older when this happened. A lot of times they just sort of look for a pattern, and they really look at how the cancel culture that we have these days. It's a big risk for things to be out on the internet and for you to be working for an organization and then that stuff come up later. And so they're doing a lot more cyber vetting. They'll use social media to broaden their potential pool. They'll put out ads that will appear on these, Facebook or Instagram feeds of users, hoping that they can kind of, attract the attention of good candidates that might match their job. So employers are using the internet a lot more in a lot of ways. So how do we demonstrate the validity of a selection battery? Okay. We could do a validation study, which is where we're going to attempt to determine the extent to which a predictor is related to a criterion. And so there is predictive validity, there's concurrent validity, and then there's cross-validation. And I'll talk about each of those in more detail. And then there's validity generalization. And this is the issue of whether the validity extends to other situations. And I'll wrap up this lecture today with that concept. Okay, so predictive validity. So we want to know with these predictors how this person who we are just meeting maybe for the first time as we're administering these predictors, how they're actually going to perform on the job, right? We're trying to forecast their job performance. So that's what we mean by predictive validity. Can we validly, accurately predict a person's performance on the job using these measures? So the way that we establish the predictive validity is we gather the predictor data on all the applicants. So everybody who's up for the job completes our battery of tests, whatever we've decided we want to use. We hire some of those employees. We hire some of those applicants to become employees, right? So some of them get hired and some of them don't. Then we have some criterion that we're going to use, usually after some number of months on the job. You guys might be familiar with being hired and you're sort of on probation for 90 days. Some situations it might be more like 6 months or a year when we go back and assess whether this person was actually a very good fit for the job. Usually the ones with longer deadlines are ones where you might need to sort of grow in the job, where maybe when you first get there, it could be a little bit shaky and it takes you a little while to learn the system and all those kinds of things. So a lot of times with those kinds of really complex jobs, you may have a longer period before the criterion measurement. In other kinds of jobs, it might be 3 months or something like that. So we're going to see how they're actually performing. So some kind of criterion is going to be administered, and it could be, tests to assess, efficiency, accuracy, all those things that we talked about before. And then we're going to analyze the data looking at the predictor score by the criterion score. And that's going to produce what's called a validity coefficient. So we're going to be able to actually find out how well that predictor score is associated or related to the actual criterion score. What we would like to find is that there's a strong correlation between the predictor score and the criterion score, right? We want to see that that predictor is actually predicting. So you can see that there's multiple steps here. You can see that there's a lot of risk here, right? Because we're going to administer all these individual tests during the selection process. We're going to actually hire people. They're actually going to work for us for some amount of time before we ultimately can determine whether our battery of tests predicted their performance. So there's a little risk. There's an investment that goes into the employee while we're trying to figure out whether our scale actually, our battery actually predicted their performance. And the whole point of this, remember, is obviously we're looking to hire some people. So obviously we needed to hire anyway. But the whole point of this is to find out whether in the future we should be using this battery as a predictor for future hires, right? So if you think about it like that we're actually trying to validate the battery through this process, you can see that this is a time-consuming and expensive process. So an alternative is to do concurrent validation, where we are going to actually administer the predictor and assess the validity of that predictor at the same time. It's a lot more viable than predictive validity studies because there's less expense and it's less time consuming and a little less risky. So what we're going to do here is we're going to administer the predictor and the criterion at the same time to people who already work for us. So you take your existing incumbents, you've performance evaluated them, and you have now decided which ones of them are the top performers, the mediocre performers. You've got your information about the incumbent already as far as the criterion. And then you administer the predictors to them and see whether those predictors actually correlate with the performance on the job. So we're actually going to do a correlation between on these incumbents, between how we are rating them as incumbents and then how they perform on those predictors. You can see how this could be a lot less expensive and risky because these are people who already work for us. And we can right now find out whether the people who we are on the job judging to be, successful are actually the ones who are scoring higher on the predictors. And the ones who are on the job and we're not as satisfied with are actually doing more poorly on the predictors. Now, if you're completely satisfied with every single incumbent that you have, you're not going to have enough variation on the criterion variable to really have any insight into whether the predictor is correlating with it. So you need to have some employees that you're not super satisfied with. So in case you're thinking to yourself, well, we'll get all the good workers and see whether the predictor shows that they would have been good workers. You don't want to do that. You want to have some variability among your employees. So I don't know if it's, the day before we're handing out pink slips to some of these employees because we're not satisfied with their performance. But we want to see if the battery correlates with the criterion performance. And when we do this correlation between the predictor score and the criterion score, it's called a validity coefficient. So we can tell whether the predictor is valid or not by administering this concurrent predictor plus criterion. So you can see how that'd be a lot less risky for a company. Now here's the thing. We may find that our predictors are correlating well with performance, either whether we do it as a predictive validity study or we do it as a concurrent study. We may find that there's a correlation between the predictor and the criterion, and we think, okay, right on, this predictor works. Well, we don't want to get too happy after just, one administration or one validation. We want to make sure that those same predictors and those same criteria produce the same outcomes for different samples, because what might be a perfect, predictor battery criterion assessment for this cohort of employees might not work very well for the next cohort that comes through. So you want to always be cross-validating, it's called. You want to test it again on another sample and make sure that we aren't experiencing validity shrinkage where it's getting less and less valid. So the predictor, so we're going to calculate the predicted score for the current sample from a regression equation of the first sample. And then we're going to correlate that predicted score with the actual criterion score for a second sample. And we want to compare the current regression score from the first sample to the current sample and make sure that they are the same. Now, there could be regression towards the mean and the other things that could impact it, but we want to make sure that they are basically consistent. Otherwise, we might have a battery of tests that's really working for some people and not for other people. For maybe one age group and not another age group. Maybe for one group of applicants who all came from the same university and not for applicants who came from another university. Or applicants from one race and it doesn't work for the other, or one sex and it doesn't work for the other. We want to make sure that what we now think is a good predictor is predictive for lots of different kinds of samples. Otherwise, we will be very unhappy in the future when we try and use that same predictor and in fact it was idiosyncratic. It was only working for that one group. Smaller shrinkage is better. Isn't that always a policy? Smaller shrinkage, right, is always better. All right, and then validity generalization. This is where we're going to use meta-analysis. I think I've talked about this before. Meta-analysis is when you're going to look across lots of different studies. We're going to treat all of them as if they're one big study. We're going to use all the data from all the different studies. And so we're going to weight and combine the validity coefficients across studies or across situations to determine if the validity generalizes across situations, right? So if one researcher used this battery of tests to predict the performance of applicants to Microsoft, could we use this same battery to predict success at Google or at Safeway? Oh, wow, I went to a whole other field, didn't I? Yeah. Like, does it work across similar situations? Does it work across vastly different situations, right? Like, we want to know how generalizable this validity is, how generalizable the predictive validity of this battery really is. What we want to try and figure out is the situational specificity. Some tests may be really awesome for certain situations and not very awesome for different kinds of jobs or different kinds of situations. Usually what we're going to find is that a battery will work well for certain kinds of jobs, like managerial or, production or education, or, right? Like, it might work in certain categories and then not across others. There has to be a lot of similarity in their jobs. And remember, we talked about how it has to start off with job analysis. So it makes a lot of sense that our validity generalization is really going to only extend to the kinds of jobs that have similar kinds of tasks, similar case-outs, stuff like that. No one test or measure is a good predictor for every job. It used to be in the old days that they acted like, an application blank was all you needed to determine who was an application blank, and an unstructured interview is all that you really needed for hiring good employees. We now know that kind of, you can't say all jobs are going to be well hired through those kinds of measures. So we want to try and make sure that we're using test or measures, a battery that's really a good predictor for the kind of job that we're hiring for. All right, I think that's a good time to take a break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about, okay, so those are some, statistical things that we could do. Let's talk about some practical approaches to selection in our next segment.